Is this some kind of joke? The voice, sharp and laced with the arrogance of a fresh-out-of-the-academy officer, cut through the humid, cloying air of the engine room. Lieutenant Commander Thorne, his jaw tight and his pristine white uniform already showing faint maps of sweat, glared from behind a bank of silent monitors. His question was aimed at a figure standing quietly near the main turbine, a man whose presence was an affront to Thorne's entire world. The man was old, perhaps 70, with hands stained by a lifetime of grease and oil. He wore simple dark blue overalls, a stark contrast to the crisp uniforms of the dozen or so engineers who now stood idle, their faces a mixture of frustration and thinly veiled amusement. He was James Jim Vance, a name that meant nothing to them. He simply stood, his gaze fixed not on the hostile officer but on the colossal, lifeless machine before them. His calm was a quiet island in a sea of rising panic. For 48 agonizing hours, the USS Vigilance, one of the Navy's most formidable aircraft carriers, had been dead in the water. A catastrophic failure in the primary propulsion system had silenced its mighty heart, leaving it adrift in the vast, indifferent expanse of the Pacific. Elite engineering teams had been flown in, diagnostics had been run until the computers threatened to overheat, and every procedure in the manual had been followed, then re-followed to the letter. Nothing. The ship, a floating city of 5,000 souls and billions of dollars of taxpayer money, was a sitting duck. Lieutenant Commander Thorne, as the chief engineer, felt the immense pressure of this failure coalescing directly on him. He was a man of the new Navy, a prodigy of simulations and advanced degrees. He understood fluid dynamics, thermal efficiency, and nuclear-powered steam generation on a theoretical level that was second to none. But the engines wouldn't start. And now, this relic. "I asked you a question," Thorne snapped, stepping down from the control platform. The metallic clang of his boots on the gangway echoed in the tense silence. "Who the hell are you and what are you doing in my engine room?" Jim Vance didn't turn, he just listened, to the silence. To the faint, almost imperceptible groans of a cooling system under strain. To the low hum of the emergency diesel generators, a pathetic substitute for the roar of the main engines. The younger engineers exchanged smirks. Thorne's frustration was their entertainment. "He's with me," a voice grumbled from the hatchway. Rear Admiral Pike stood there, his face grim, his uniform immaculate but his eyes weary. He had made the call, a call that had been met with disbelief and quiet ridicule among his staff. A call to a retired Master Chief Petty Officer living a quiet life somewhere in coastal Maine. Thorne straightened instantly, his hostility shifting to a more formal, if still resentful posture. "Admiral, with all due respect, this is a highly restricted area. We are dealing with a critical failure in a nuclear-powered vessel. We have the best engineers in the fleet working on it. We don't have time for visitors." His gaze flicked dismissively toward the old man in overalls. Pike's eyes narrowed. "The best engineers in the fleet have had 2 days, Commander. The ship is still a barge. Master Chief Vance is here at my request." "Master Chief?" Thorne repeated, the title tasting like ash in his mouth. An enlisted man, an old one. He couldn't hide his disdain. "Admiral, his service records must be decades old. The technology has evolved. We're dealing with integrated digital control systems, not steam gauges and levers. And yet the levers you're pulling aren't working," Pike retorted, his voice dangerously low. The Admiral's public rebuke hung in the air, thick and heavy. The smirks on the faces of the junior officers vanished, replaced by a tense focus on their consoles. Thorne's face flushed a deep, angry red. He felt the sting of humiliation, not just from his superior, but from the silent judgment of the old man who still hadn't bothered to look at him. Jim Vance finally moved. He ran a worn, calloused hand along a thick conduit, his touch gentle, almost reverent. It was a gesture of a musician tuning an instrument, not an engineer inspecting a machine. His eyes scanned the labyrinth of pipes and machinery, not with the analytical gaze of a technician, but with the holistic view of an artist seeing a complete picture. He paused, his eyes landing on a small, seemingly insignificant auxiliary valve assembly, tucked away behind a larger coolant pipe. It was a piece of equipment deemed non-critical by the modern diagnostic systems, a relic of an older design philosophy that prioritized manual overrides and backups. The schematics Thorne's team had been studying on their tablets barely even registered its function in detail. Jim reached into the deep pocket of his overalls and pulled out a simple tool. It wasn't a sophisticated electronic device. It was a machinist's stethoscope, its metal bell tarnished with age, the rubber tubing cracked and worn. He placed the bell against the valve housing, closed his eyes and listened. A few of the younger engineers couldn't suppress a quiet snort of laughter. It was absurd. It was primitive. Thorne folded his arms across his chest, a look of pure, unadulterated contempt on his face. He was allowing this farce to play out only because the Admiral was present. He would have this old man escorted out and logged as a security breach the moment Pike was gone. But as Vance listened, his expression changed. It was a subtle shift, a tightening around the eyes, a slight furrow of his brow, a flicker of memory, sharp and vivid, cut through the present, the deafening roar of a different engine room, decades ago during a violent storm in the North Atlantic. Alarms blaring, the deck heaving, the air thick with the smell of ozone and fear. He saw the face of a young ensign, wide-eyed with panic, as he, a much younger Master Chief, had used this same stethoscope to diagnose a hairline fracture in a steam line. Moments before it would have ruptured catastrophically. He remembered the feeling of the vibration through the metal, a specific discordant hum that he had never forgotten, a hum he was hearing again now, faint and insidious, a ghost in the machine. Back in the silent engine room of the Vigilance, the scene remained tense. The Admiral watched Vance, his face a mask of anxious hope. Thorne watched them both, his impatience growing with every passing second. The silent standoff was beginning to feel unbearable. Unseen by the senior officers, a young petty officer, a woman named Chen, stood by a secondary communications panel. She had been watching the entire exchange, her initial amusement turning to a growing sense of unease. She had seen the way the old man had touched the machinery, the look in his eyes. It wasn't the look of a confused old-timer. It was the look of a man who was seeing something they were all missing. She had also seen the undisguised contempt on her superior's face. She knew Lieutenant Commander Thorne. She knew his arrogance, his absolute faith in his own modern training, and his dismissal of anyone who didn't fit his mold. She had heard the whispers about who the old man might be, a legend, a ghost from the old Navy, a man they called the Engine Whisperer. She saw the cold, dead readouts on the main control panel, and the rising panic in the eyes of her fellow engineers. This wasn't a technical problem anymore. It was becoming a crisis of leadership. With a deep breath, her fingers flew across the console, typing a discreet message. It wasn't to anyone in the engine room, or even to the bridge. It was a direct, encrypted message to the Fleet Admiral's personal aide, a man she had once served under and knew to be a no-nonsense problem solver. The message was simple. Sir, Admiral Pike has brought a civilian consultant aboard the Vigilance to assess the engine failure. Name is James Vance. LCDR Thorne is obstructing. Situation critical. The crew is losing confidence. She hit send just as Thorne's patience finally snapped. Admiral, this has gone on long enough, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. We have protocols to follow. I must insist that this gentleman be removed from the engine room so my team can get back to work. The call had been made. The witness had acted. The pieces were now in motion, far beyond the confines of the silent steel heart of the crippled carrier. Help was coming, but not the kind anyone in that room expected. The impending arrival would not be a team of more engineers, but a reckoning. Inside the quiet, climate-controlled command center at Naval Base Coronado, Fleet Admiral Marcus Thorne, a man whose stern portrait hung in halls of power across the globe, was in the middle of a high-level video conference with the Joint Chiefs. His aide, a young, impeccably professional lieutenant, approached him and placed a tablet quietly on the desk in front of him. The Admiral, a man renowned for his unshakable composure, glanced down at the incoming message. His eyes, accustomed to scanning complex strategic reports, narrowed slightly as he read the name, James Vance. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. He held up a hand and the four-star general on the main screen immediately stopped speaking. The other admirals and generals in the conference waited, a collective hush falling over the secure line. Such an interruption was unheard of. Gentlemen, Admiral Thorne said, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of steel, I have an urgent operational matter to attend to. We will reconvene at 1600. He didn't wait for a reply, ending the conference with a single tap on his screen. He turned to his aide, his expression now one of intense, focused urgency. Get me Admiral Pike on the Vigilance now. Secure channel, and get me a line to the Secretary of the Navy's office. Inform them that I am initiating a personal command intervention. The aide's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. A personal command intervention was a tool of last resort, an action that stripped layers of command and put the Fleet Admiral himself in direct operational control. It was almost never used. Sir, the aide began, the matter on the Vigilance. The matter on the Vigilance, Admiral Thorne cut in, his voice sharp, now involves Master Chief James Vance. Do you have any idea who that is? The aide, a top graduate of the Naval Academy, a man who could recite the specifications of every ship in the fleet, shook his head. "No, sir. His records are classified above my clearance." Admiral Thorne stood, his powerful frame casting a long shadow across the room. "He's the man who wrote the book on these engines. Not the manuals you read, Lieutenant. The real book. The one written in sweat and grit and intuition. He's the man they called when the prototypes were failing on the test stand 30 years ago. He's the reason those reactors have a safety record. Now get me that connection." As the aide scrambled to comply, the Admiral stared out the window towards the sea, his mind racing. He knew Vance. He had been a young captain on a destroyer when Vance, then a Master Chief, had saved his ship from a catastrophic engine fire, using little more than a wrench and an almost supernatural understanding of the machine's soul. The thought that a pompous by-the-book officer like Lieutenant Commander Thorne, a man who, to his eternal frustration, shared his last name but none of his humility was disrespecting him, made his blood run cold. The situation was no longer just about a broken engine. It was about honor. Back on the USS Vigilance, the atmosphere in the engine room had grown even more toxic. Emboldened by what he saw as the Admiral's inaction, Lieutenant Commander Thorne decided to press his advantage. He saw the old man not as a potential savior, but as a scapegoat, a perfect symbol of the outdated thinking Pike represented. "All right, that's it," Thorne announced, stepping directly in front of Jim Vance, forcing the old man to finally look at him. "I am the Chief Engineering Officer on this vessel. I am ordering you to cease this performance and vacate my engine room immediately. If you do not comply, I will have you forcibly removed and placed under guard for interfering with naval operations during a crisis." He turned to two burly enlisted security personnel who had been standing by. "Escort this man to the brig." The guards hesitated, looking from the furious lieutenant commander to the silent admiral. Pike's face was a thundercloud. "Commander, you are wildly out of line." "Am I, sir?" Thorne shot back, his arrogance now boiling over into open insubordination. "Or am I the only one here trying to maintain military discipline and follow procedure? This ship is my responsibility. I will not have it jeopardized by some—" Before Pike could respond, before the guards could make their move, the engine room's main communication speaker crackled to life, bypassing all local controls. The voice that boomed through the space was not that of the ship's captain or the executive officer. It was a voice that every single person in that room, from Admiral Pike down to the lowest-ranking seaman, recognized instantly. It was the voice of God in the modern Navy. "This is Fleet Admiral Thorne, who is in command in that engine room." A wave of shock silenced the compartment. Lieutenant Commander Thorne froze, his face draining of all color. He felt a cold dread wash over him that had nothing to do with the broken engine. He had just publicly threatened a man in front of his entire department, and now the highest-ranking officer in the entire fleet was on the line. Admiral Pike was the first to recover. "Admiral Pike here, sir." Pike, the voice on the speaker, acknowledged, dispensing with pleasantries. "Report. Why is Master Chief Vance being threatened with arrest?" The use of the title Master Chief was deliberate and sharp. It conferred a respect that Thorne had pointedly denied. Thorne felt his knees weaken. The fleet admiral knew the old man's name and his rank. "We have a difference of opinion on procedure, Admiral," Pike said carefully, choosing his words with the skill of a seasoned diplomat. "I see," the voice on the speaker replied, the two words dripping with ice. "Lieutenant Commander Thorne." Thorne swallowed hard, his throat suddenly bone dry. "Sir, is it true you have failed to restart the main engine for 48 hours? "Sir, we have encountered unforeseen technical challenges. Is it also true," the fleet admiral's voice cut across him like a laser, "that you have dismissed the counsel of the most experienced propulsion specialist in the United States Navy, a man I personally credit with saving the lives of over 200 sailors on the USS Kensington?" Stunned silence. The engineers stared at Jim Vance, this quiet old man in greasy overalls, in a completely new light. The legend was real. "Sir, I was not aware," Thorne stammered, his entire world collapsing around him. "That is precisely the problem, Commander. You were not aware. You were arrogant. You let your pride and your faith in digital readouts blind you to the wisdom standing right in front of you. You are hereby relieved of your duties as Chief Engineer. Report to your quarters and await further orders. Admiral Pike, you will give Master Chief Vance whatever he requires. And I do mean whatever." The communication line went dead, leaving a silence more profound than before. Lieutenant Commander Thorne stood, ashen-faced and trembling, stripped of his authority and utterly humiliated in front of his subordinates. Without a word, he turned and walked stiffly out of the engine room, his career in tatters. A convoy of helicopters was already thundering through the sky, dispatched from the nearest naval air station the moment the fleet admiral had hung up. They weren't carrying more engineers or tools. They were carrying the Admiral's personal staff, a team of investigators, and a full public affairs contingent. The message was clear. This was no longer a simple repair job. It was a demonstration. Aboard the Vigilance, the atmosphere had transformed. The air of mockery was gone, replaced by one of silent, profound respect. The engineers who had been snickering just minutes before now watched Jim Vance with a kind of awe. He was no longer just an old man. He was a living piece of naval history, a legend in their midst. Jim, seemingly unfazed by the high-level drama, simply turned back to his work. He handed his stethoscope to the young petty officer Chen, who had made the fateful call. "Here," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Listen, tell me what you hear." She took the instrument, her hands trembling slightly, and placed the bell against the auxiliary valve housing where he had indicated. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the low hum of the emergency generators, and focused. At first she heard nothing but the gentle gurgle of the coolant. Then she caught it. A tiny, almost imperceptible flutter, a high-frequency vibration that didn't belong. It was a sound so faint that the ship's multi-million-dollar acoustic sensors had dismissed it as background noise. "There's a tremor," she whispered, her eyes flying open. "It's irregular." Jim nodded slowly. "It's a harmonic resonance. The valve isn't closing completely. It's letting a microscopic amount of steam bypass into the secondary coolant line. Not enough to show up on the pressure gauges, but just enough to throw off the turbine's balance and trigger the automatic shutdown. The computer sees an imbalance and thinks the turbine shaft is failing. It's trying to protect the engine, but it's looking at the wrong problem." He then began to give a series of quiet, precise instructions. He didn't shout or bark orders. He spoke with the calm authority of a man who was not guessing, but knew. He had them manually override the digital controls for the auxiliary valve, a procedure that wasn't even in the modern emergency checklists. He had 2 engineers use a heavy wrench to manually tighten the valve seating by a quarter of a turn, a task that required brute force guided by his precise instructions. As they worked, the first of the helicopters arrived, descending onto the carrier's vast flight deck. Out stepped not a team of mechanics, but a 2-star admiral from the fleet admiral's staff, flanked by a full honor guard of Marines in their dress blues. They didn't head for the bridge. Their destination was the engine room. They arrived just as Jim Vance wiped his hands on a rag and turned to the main control panel, where Petty Officer Chen now stood, her face a mask of concentration. "All right, young lady," Jim said softly. "Let's bring her back to life. Initiate the startup sequence. Slow and steady." Chen took a deep breath, her fingers hovering over the console. She looked at the blank screens, then at the old man beside her. She chose to trust the man, not the machine. She began the sequence. For a moment, there was silence. Then a low hum began to build, a sound that grew steadily in pitch and volume. A deep, powerful vibration rolled through the deck plates, a feeling the crew had not felt for 2 long days. The lights in the engine room flickered once, then burned with a new, steady intensity as the main generators kicked in. On the main screen, the diagnostic icons, which had been stubbornly red, began to blink amber, then one by one turned a solid, reassuring green. The roar of the main turbine filled the space, a triumphant, living sound that echoed through the entire ship. The USS Vigilance was alive again. Just as the cheers began to erupt from the assembled engineers, the 2-star Admiral and his honor guard stepped into the engine room. They ignored everyone else. They walked directly to Jim Vance, who stood quietly watching the gauges settle. The Admiral, a man who commanded his own battle group, came to a halt 2 feet in front of the old man in the greasy overalls. He raised his hand in a sharp, perfect salute. "Master Chief Vance," the Admiral's voice boomed, clear and formal, cutting through the celebratory noise. "On behalf of the United States Navy and by order of the Fleet Admiral, I am here to recognize you, Master Chief Petty Officer James Vance, recipient of the Navy Cross for actions aboard the USS Kensington in 1988, where your bravery prevented a reactor meltdown. Recipient of 2 Navy and Marine Corps medals for developing engine-saving procedures still in use today. Lead consultant on the Nimitz-class propulsion design team. Your service record is a testament to the highest ideals of the Navy." He then read a citation, his voice echoing through the now silent engine room. He spoke of storms weathered, of fires fought, of disasters averted not by computers but by the hands and mind of this one man. The crowd of young engineers listened, their faces a mixture of shame and awe. They had been in the presence of greatness, and had been blind to it. When the citation was finished, the Admiral lowered his salute, but remained at attention. He turned his head slightly towards the disgraced Lieutenant Commander Thorne, who had been summoned to witness the ceremony. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," the Admiral said, his voice cold. "Rank and credentials do not equal wisdom. Technology is a tool, not a replacement for instinct and experience. You forgot that. You dismissed a hero. Our Navy is built on the shoulders of giants like Master Chief Vance. Do not ever forget it." He then turned back to Jim. "The Fleet Admiral sends his personal regards and his deepest apologies for the disrespect you were shown." Jim simply nodded, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. He looked not at the Admiral, but at the humbled engineers, and at young Petty Officer Chen, who was watching him with tears in her eyes. "The ship is fine," Jim said, his voice calm and forgiving. "That's all that matters. The machine just needed someone to listen to it. Sometimes people do too." As he spoke, another memory surfaced, not of a crisis, but of a quiet moment. A young, eager sailor, the very same man who was now Fleet Admiral Thorne, had come to him after the Kensington fire, asking how he knew what to do. Jim had picked up his old machinist's stethoscope, the one he still carried. "This doesn't just let you hear the engine," he had told the young officer. "It forces you to be quiet. It forces you to pay attention to the little things. That's where the real truth usually is." He had handed the stethoscope to the future Admiral, a symbolic passing of wisdom. The formal apology from the Navy was swift and public. An official letter was placed in Lieutenant Commander Thorne's permanent file, effectively ending any chance of further promotion. More importantly, a new training mandate was issued fleet-wide. It was called the Vance Protocol, and it required all engineering officers to spend time learning the older, manual systems, and to study historical case files of failures that were solved by intuition, not just diagnostics. A week later, on a quiet street in San Diego, a man in a crisp but undecorated naval uniform was jogging. It was former Lieutenant Commander Thorne. As he rounded a corner, he saw an old man tending to his garden, carefully pruning a rose bush. It was Jim Vance. Thorne stopped, his heart pounding. He had been rehearsing this moment in his mind for days. He walked slowly towards the fence. "Master Chief," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Jim looked up, his eyes showing no hint of malice or triumph. He simply nodded. "Commander, I wanted to apologize," Thorne stammered, the words feeling inadequate. "I was arrogant. I was wrong. What you did, it was my job," Jim finished for him, his voice gentle. "And you were trying to do yours. You just forgot to listen." He snipped a perfect white rose from the bush and offered it over the fence. "The most complicated machines are still just a collection of simple parts. You just have to find the one that's out of tune." Thorne took the rose, its simple beauty a stark contrast to the complex, unyielding machinery he had dedicated his life to. He understood then. It wasn't about man versus machine. It was about humility. It was about recognizing that true strength often came in the quietest, most unassuming forms. He finally nodded, a genuine humble gesture of respect, and in that quiet moment, a lesson was truly learned. Thank you for watching Veteran Valor Stories. If this story of quiet heroism and earned respect moved you, please like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel for more tales of the brave men and women who have served